Good afternoon, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I have enormous respect for the Governor-General. I think many Australians, hopefully all Australians, would agree that Her Excellency has done a very good job, and I particularly enjoyed her outspokenness on some controversial issues of late. I also have great respect for the office of the Governor-General, and in fact in 1989 I was the Army aide-de-camp to, first of all, His Excellency Sir Ninian Stephen for a short while, and then Bill Hayden in his first year. So I understand how Government House works. I understand the important work that Government House does. And I make the point again, I have great respect for Her Excellency. But I think there does need to be a greater public discussion about why, in mid-November last year, we again had the Australian representative of a foreign head of state open this parliament. It strikes me as an anachronism that the Queen of England is also the Queen of Australia, and that our parliament is opened by her representative in this country. Surely we've grown up and moved on. I have fond feelings towards our mother country and what England did to settle us and to help us grow and to become a great nation. But surely now, 226 years after the first fleet sailed into Port Jackson, it's beyond time that we have an Australian head of state and an Australian that opens this parliament. Moreover, someone that opens this parliament not by reading a speech prepared by or at least approved by the Australian government, but someone who reads his or her own speech. A speech in which he or her is independent enough and free to say what he or she thinks that this parliament should achieve over the 3 years of the 44th parliament, what he or she thinks that this government should achieve during its 3 years in power. Surely it is beyond time that we could have someone, when opening the parliament, who could stand up and tackle controversy and lay out what is needed and what is expected during these challenging times. Personally, I would like to see an Australian head of state have opened the 44th parliament, or open the 45th parliament, by making it clear that he or she expects the government of the day to tackle the tough issues. And let's face it, moving money around is relatively easy. Tackling policy and the tough policy challenges facing us, that is difficult. Wouldn't it be great that at the opening of the parliament our head of state would say, I expect this government and this parliament to deal with the issue of problem gambling in this country. The fact that 95,000 Australian problem gamblers lose between them something like $5,000 million each year on the poker machines, that he or she expects the government to do something about that. A government that needs to be mindful of the fact that for every one of those 95,000 problem gamblers, there are between 5 and 10 people adversely affected in some way. That as a result of that $5,000 million lost, that people are losing their jobs, they're going hungry, their kids are going hungry, they're living in houses without electricity, they're at a higher likelihood of taking their own lives. Wouldn't it be great if an Australian head of state stood up and said at the opening of parliament, I expect this parliament, this government to tackle the big issues like the live animal export industry, which accounts for only 8% of the beef production in this country. Someone who stood up and said, look, I expect people to understand that that trade is not in Australia's economic self-interest, that it's systemically cruel, that it's not popular. And someone to drill down a bit and to say, well, one of the reasons that beef producers are relying so much on the live animal export trade is because of the monopoly of Woolies and Coles. That's why Australian beef producers are being paid no more now than they were being paid 15 years ago. Wouldn't it be good, Deputy Speaker, if at the opening of parliament an Australian head of state stood up and said, I expect the parliament and the next government to be a compassionate parliament, a compassionate government. Someone who stood up and said perhaps that the cuts to foreign aid, which have now been announced, of over $100 million, is simply not acceptable. That cutting foreign aid is not the right thing to do, but it's also not in Australia's self-interest. That, in fact, the way to enhance Australia's security is to build capacity in our nation and to help countries around us to be stable and have that capacity to deal with challenges like our changing climate. Someone to stand up and say that 14 years ago the Howard government committed Australia to the Millennium Goal of 0.7% of gross national income going to foreign aid, and we're still at only about half or less of that right now. And that not only is our gross level of foreign aid inadequate, but where we're paying the aid has some glaring deficiencies. Deputy Speaker, did you know that in this financial year we're only going to give $11.3 million to Iraq? $11.3 million to Iraq out of a foreign development aid budget of about $5 billion. Now, surely there's something wrong with that. I mean, this is a country that it's anarchic, and we help create the circumstances in which that anarchy is happening. Surely we have a moral obligation to give more than $11.3 million to that country out of a foreign aid budget of $5 billion. Deputy Speaker, this financial year will give $76.1 million to Pakistan, even though Pakistan is host to 1.6 million Afghan refugees. There's something out of whack here, I suggest, Deputy Speaker, that we're demonising Afghan asylum seekers who are trying to come to Australia when they're fleeing Afghanistan, which is another country that is anarchic, where the central government has little or no authority outside the capital. They're transiting through Pakistan, a developing country itself with very limited resources, very limited capacity, but yet not only do we demonise the Afghan asylum seekers, we only give Pakistan $76.1 million, which would in part help to improve the circumstances of those Afghan refugees that are resident in that country. So I come back to my point about an independent Australian head of state tackling the tough issues and being able to, instead of reading out a speech prepared by the government, or at least approved by the government, to instead to sit in the President's chair, I think, in the Senate, and to actually lay out what her expectations are of the new parliament and of the new government, to actually say what she hopes will be achieved, to actually point out the areas which are deficient that she expects a competent parliament and a competent government to address. I reckon he or she in those circumstances would sound a warning that Australia needs to start acting like a rich and civilised country and needs to start acting like a signatory to the Refugee Convention and start treating people who try and make it to Australia, start treating them with more compassion. That, in fact, as a signatory to the Refugee Convention, we have a legal obligation to give people protection, to hear their claims and to give them refuge if their claims are found to be accurate. Instead, what do? We have offshore processing. We have Manus Island, Nauru. We have basically all of Australia excised from Australia, from the migration zone, as bizarre as that would appear to be. I make the point again, Deputy Speaker. What we should be doing instead of our current regime, supported in large part by the Labor opposition, I would add, what we should instead be doing is acting like a rich and civilised country, start acting like a signatory to the Refugee Convention and start showing a bit more compassion to those who come to our shore. And you know what I would imagine might also be in that speech, Deputy Speaker, is a call to this parliament and to this government to have a more compassionate response to disadvantaged Australians. You know, in this financial year, federal government outlays will be approximately $400 billion, so $400,000 million. That is an enormous amount of money, and that is more than enough money to look after those people in our community genuinely in need. But it is not happening, whether it be the person who's waiting years for a hip replacement in my own state, or someone on Newstart. You know, Deputy Speaker, a single person, no dependents, receives $501 a fortnight for Newstart. So in other words, an unemployed person in Australia single man or woman, no children over the age of the early 20s, gets $250.50 a week to live on.
Shame.
In a country where, just about anywhere in the country, you're going to have to pay a couple $100 a week to rent a basic flat or unit or small or modest house. And then we expect that person to have enough money to buy a smart set of clothes, have a computer so they can apply for jobs online, have internet connection so they can research the job market and apply for things online, be well fed, be healthy and be able to front up and do a good job at a job interview. It doesn't work. In fact, even industry groups are saying if you want job seekers to have better prospects, you've got to pay them more than $250.50 a week. You know, if I was writing the speech at the opening parliament, I'd probably say to the parliament and to the new government, get a copy of the ACOS budget priority statement for 2040-15. Have a read of it, because there's a really good blueprint, an excellent blueprint for this parliament and for any government to follow. And you know what I'd also do, Deputy Speaker? I'd refer them to a paragraph, and excuse me if I read it, it's a longish paragraph, but I think I've got time, on page 3, because this is very telling, and I would ask in particular the members of the government who are now sitting here to pay attention to this. And I quote, "Despite the current debates about increased social security spending, Australia's spending remains comparatively low. The real budget problems lie elsewhere. Expenditure on social security payments in 2013 were 8.6% of GDP, compared with an OECD average of 13%. Of the $28 billion of growth in social security between 2002 and 2012, after inflation, $13 billion comprised increases in the age pension, and $9 billion came from increases in family payment expenses due to increases in payment rates, easing of income tests and the introduction of the baby bonus and the school kids bonus. Expenditure on New Start, and this is the Deputy Speaker, this is the part of this I'd particularly like to emphasise and bring to the attention of the government. Expenditure on New Start allowance and parenting payment declined by $4 billion over that period. That's between 2002 and 2012, despite a rise with higher unemployment during the GFC. A sharp increase in the number of New Start allowance recipients in 2013 was mainly due to the transfer of approximately 80,000 sole parents in that year from the higher parenting payment to the lower New Start allowance. So, despite claims of an inexorable rise in reliance on the disability support pension, the number of recipients peaked in the mid-2000s. That's the year, the 2000s. I could go on, but I think the point is clear, that at the moment we in fact have a beat-up about what is going on with Centrelink benefits. Deputy Speaker, I'm talking about what a speech at the opening of a parliament might sound like. Might sound like if we had an Australian head of state, an independent head of state, not reading a speech written by the government or approved by the government, but standing up as an independent, strong leadership figure in our community, telling the new parliament, telling the new government about some of the problems in our community and where he or she expects the new parliament and the new government to focus their attention. And I suspect in that speech, the Australian head of state would also urge the new government to stand up to foreign governments. He or she would probably lament the fact that it took so many decades for Australia to finally take action over East Timor. And credit where it's due to the Howard government that it did finally act, but oh, Deputy Speaker, why did it take so long? Why did it take so long for Australia to do the right thing? The speech, of course, at the opening of the parliament might address, well, I'm sure it would address, current problems. For example, the silence of successive Australian governments to the Indonesian occupation of West Papua. When's the last time an Australian government, or very many people in this place for that matter, have actually stood up and made the point that the Indonesian behaviour in West Papua has been and continues to be completely and utterly unacceptable and no better than what they did in East Timor. You know, eventually we grew up and we grew a spine and we took action over East Timor. But there's this deafening silence over what the Indonesians are also doing in West Papua. You know, since 1962, it is estimated that 100,000 West Papuans have been killed or have disappeared under the brutal military regime in place there. Of course, the Indonesians, or maybe the Australian government, say, well, there was an act of self-determination in 1969 when the Indonesians progressed their so-called act of free choice. But do you know how many West Papuans were allowed to vote at that referendum in 1969? 1,025. Only 1,025 West Papuans were allowed to vote about their future. No wonder it went down. So, in other words, the Indonesian presence there continues to be without the support, clearly without the support of the West Papuans, and should be condemned by the Australian government. So too with Tibet. Now, I give credit where it's due to former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He did take a stronger position about the Chinese occupation of Tibet, probably than I'm sure than any other Prime Minister before or since. But if I was giving a speech, heaven forbid, I don't expect this ever to happen, but if I was writing at least the speech at the opening of Parliament, I would urge the new Parliament and the new government to take a stronger position on Tibet, and to say to the Chinese that what's going on there is unacceptable, and say to the Chinese that what they must do is preserve Tibet's unique religious, cultural and linguistic traditions, safeguard its fragile environment and protect the human rights of the Tibetan people, including the rights of the nomads to maintain their traditional way of life. Deputy Speaker, I could go on, but I'm sure by now everyone gets the point I'm trying to drive home. Not only am I saying that 226 years after the first fleet sailed into Port Jackson, not only am I saying that surely enough time has passed that we should move to become a republic, I'm saying that it should be an Australian head of state who sits in the President's chair at the opening of a future parliament, and he or she speaks for all Australians as a strong leadership figure and says to the new parliament at that point in the future, or the new government, this is what he or she expects that parliament and that government to do. And he or she shouldn't read out a speech written by the Prime Minister's department or office, or at least approved by it. He or she should be a strong, independent leadership figure. In fact, I would go further, Deputy Speaker, and say that it would be in this country's best interest that eventually we will have a strong, independent Australian head of state that balances the head of government, that each would be a check on each other, and so that neither would have a monopoly on power. That would be a better arrangement than what we've got currently. Now, I qualify that, Deputy Speaker, by acknowledging that we are fortunate enough to live in one of the oldest and most successful democracies on the planet, and a great nation. Even though we still have the Union Jack at the top of the flag, we are a great independent nation. But we could be so much more. We could be so much more if we now take that step to being an independent nation with an Australian head of state. And let's change the flag. And when we have the discussion, let's not cloud the issue with misinformation and untruths. I mean, this line that we can't change the flag because so many Australian soldiers fought and died under the current flag, that's actually untrue. The fact is the blue ensign was actually only legislated as the official flag in the 1950s. So, in fact, most Australians who have fought and died for this country have done it under the Union Jack and under the red ensign, a flag that now is not in widespread use, except by the Merchant Navy. So we need to have an honest and open discussion about it. And we really do need people in this place to be the leadership figures to drive that debate into the future. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.